Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the History Cloak channel. I'm Mr. McGee. In the last episode, we ended with Vladimir Lenin becoming the dictator of the Soviet Union. Well, in today's episode, we're going to focus on his leadership of the Soviet Union and what the effect of that leadership was on the Soviet Union. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's begin. Lenin's first task as dictator of the Soviet Union was to pull the Soviet Union out of World War I. Now, in order to do that, he would need to negotiate with the Central Powers. The Central Powers were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Now, one small note, the man that Lenin sent to negotiate this treaty was a guy named Leon Trotsky. Now, we're going to hear that name again, probably in this episode and definitely in the next episode, so I want you to keep that in mind. Now, in any negotiation, you want to negotiate from a position of strength. Unfortunately for Lenin, he did not have that position. The Soviet Union was in a weakened state. So when they went to negotiate with the Central Powers had a list of demands that the Soviet Union had to meet if they were to sign a treaty with the Central Powers. On top of this list of demands that we will get into in a second, the Ukrainian nationalists sent their own negotiating team to negotiate about Ukraine. So this only complicated matters during the negotiation to get out of World War I. In order to finally get out of World War I, the Soviet Union had to do the following. First of all, they had to recognize the independence of Ukraine, recognize the independence of Finland, and recognize the independence of Georgia. And no, we're not talking about the state of Georgia, we're talking about the country of Georgia that's located in the Caucasus Mountains. On top of that, they also had to give up the Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to Germany. They also had to give up Poland to Germany as well. On top of that, they also had to give up a few regions to the Ottoman Empire as well. In totality, the Soviet Union would have to lose 1 million square miles of land, about a third of its population, and most of its coal, iron, and oil stores. Leon Trotsky went back to the Soviet Union and said, hey, you know what guys? Let's just have a neither war nor peace policy. So we're not going to fight the Central Powers, but we're also not going to sign this treaty. Lenin and the Bolsheviks agreed to this idea. During Trotsky's time away, the Germans had already signed a separate peace with the Ukrainian nationalists, recognizing Ukraine as their own country. When Leon Trotsky got back to the negotiating table, he announced the new policy of neither war nor peace, and the Germans just looked and said, okay, well then we'll just continue fighting. Alright, remember we talked about how important it is to negotiate from a position of strength? The Germans had that strength. They were far superior with their military to the Soviets. So the Germans then continued fighting, and the Soviets went, oh wait, no. Okay, so, hey, remember we were talking about neither war nor peace? Just kidding. How about peace? Treaty, quickly. Lenin's new orders to Trotsky were pretty simple. Just sign the treaty. So on March 3rd, 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed. Brest-Litovsk is the town where the negotiations took place. That town is in an area that is now part of Belarus today. Now, because we've been so focused on Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, it's important that we stop for a second and take a look at two facts that don't have anything to do with him, but are going to become important really, really fast. Number one, the Romanov family is still alive. Now, if you remember, we talked about the fact that Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne. He saw the protests in Petrograd and said, hey, I'm out of here. Well, he and his entire family were captured. And right now, in the spring of 1918, they are being held captive in the town of Yekaterinburg, Russia. Number two, the Tsar still has government officials and military officers who are loyal to him. So I don't want it to look as if once the Bolsheviks take over, there's no opposition, the Tsars just kind of disappeared from the face of the earth. It is important that we know those two factors because of what's about to happen next. Once the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed, Lenin then moved to cancel all foreign loan payments. The Tsar had taken out foreign loans in the past, the provisional government had taken out foreign loans in the past. Well, Lenin said, hey, you know what? We're not paying these back. And so therefore, they're now canceled. Lenin also nationalized all foreign lands. Now, nationalized is just a fancy way of saying the government took over. So in other words, if you were a foreigner and you happened to own land in Russia, now you don't. Lenin's government took over that land and said that land now belongs to the government. Too bad, so sad, if you're a foreigner who happens to own that land. After the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, after the cancellation of all foreign loan payments, after the taking over, the nationalization of all foreign lands in Russia, those forces loyal to Tsar Nicholas II attacked, and thus began the Russian Civil War. The Russian Civil War became known as the battle between the whites versus the reds. The whites represented those loyal to the Tsar, the reds represented the Bolsheviks and those loyal to Lenin. Red was also the color used to symbolize communism as well. Whenever we're learning about a war, we could take an hour plus time to just focus on the different facets of a war, meaning the different shifting alliances, the different battles in a war, and how those battles played a part in this person's career or that person's career. But for us, with this video, we're going to keep it narrowly focused. So, I'm going to focus on the several key events during the Russian Civil War that will help us to understand the Soviet Union going forward after the Civil War was finished. Number one, the Romanov family. Now, if you remember, they were being held prisoner in the city of Yekaterinburg, Russia. Well, the local Soviet there was afraid that the White Army might come in and rescue the Romanov family. So on the night of June 16th, 1918, Tsar Nicholas II and his wife and their 5 children were taken into the basement of the house where they were being held prisoner and shot to death. So for those of you who grew up watching the very popular animated film Anastasia, you know the one about the lost princess, and oh, she doesn't realize that she's a princess of Russia from the Romanov line, and oh, she lives happily ever after. No, she died with the rest of them in real life, because sometimes history does not involve musical numbers or talking animals. Sometimes history just stinks. In August of 1918, a man from a rival communist group attempted to assassinate Vladimir Lenin as he was leaving a factory after a speech. Lenin was shot in the neck and in the shoulder, badly injuring him. Now, before we move on and cover more of the key events that happened in the Russian Civil War, it's important for us to know that when Lenin first became dictator, he created a group called the Cheka. The Cheka were the secret police of Russia. Now, if you're asking yourself, hey, secret police, is that the same as just a normal police officer? Like, maybe is he undercover? No. Okay, a normal police officer, his job is just to stop crime that's on the books in that country or city or town. So, if it's illegal to rob a bank, the policeman is there to stop people from robbing banks, or if someone does rob a bank, to try to catch the person that did it. The secret police, when you hear that term secret police, the secret police job is to make sure that nobody opposes the government. Their job is to find out who is trying to oppose the government, who's speaking out against the government, and stop them. You find secret police in countries that are run by a dictator, where there's no freedom of speech. Because think about it, if there's freedom of speech, I'm allowed to speak out against the leader of the country, I'm allowed to speak out against the government. But where there's no freedom of speech, that is where you have the secret police to enforce that no freedom of speech and make sure that nobody opposes the government and nobody opposes that dictator. Once the assassination attempt on Lenin's life had taken place, his Cheka were called into action. They rounded up anyone who was suspected of being disloyal to Lenin or who had not shown enough loyalty to Lenin or anyone who had spoken out against Lenin. So that meant any Russian who was loyal to the Tsar or who had spoken out against Lenin as part of the Menshevik group, they were all rounded up. And between September and October of 1918, 100,000 Russians were executed by Lenin's Cheka. In order to try to win the war against the whites, Lenin introduced what he called war communism. War communism basically meant the government took over everything. The government took over all the factories. The government took over every industry. And also, on top of that, Lenin's government also took all extra grain from the peasants to try to feed the Red Army as they battled the whites. The result of taking over all industry and all manufacturing, by the way, that word nationalizing would be appropriate for this. So, since Lenin nationalized all the manufacturing, all the industry, the result was that output, in other words, the amount that was produced by all the various industries, all the various factories, went down. Now, some of you may be asking, hey, wait a second, how did output go down? Wouldn't the fact that the government took over all the manufacturing and all the industry cause output to go up? Well, the answer is no. That never happens, and here's why. Reason number one, money. Think about it for a second. If Mr. McGee owns his own business, and I know that if I work really hard in that business, if I make the right decisions, if I can come up with a new angle for the products that I sell, I know that I will benefit. I can make more money. My life can improve from running my business and running it efficiently and running it well. But if the government comes and takes over my business and says, hey, Mr. McGee, this business is now ours. You'll produce what we tell you to produce, and we're taking most of the proceeds from it. Well, what incentive do I have to work as hard as I would work if I owned the business? So that's number one that causes output to go down. Reason number two, efficiency. The government is a lot less efficient at running things than the person who manages, let's say, the factory. Think about it this way. What's going to be more efficient? The manager who actually runs the factory, who knows all the inner workings of the factory, understands the population around him, what they would want, and actually understands maybe the little key pieces of anything from machinery to distribution of products. And he knows all those things down to the nitty-gritty details. Is he going to understand that and be able to move quickly to make changes? Or is the government, let's say 100 miles away, that doesn't really know anything about the town or the factory, will they be able to make decisions as quickly and be able to understand all the nitty-gritty bits of how the factory works? Well, no, it's going to be the manager. And yet, Lenin's government is now running all of the industries and all of the factories in the Soviet Union. Thus, output is going to go down. The result of Lenin's war communism, his taking over of all the industries and all the factories in the Soviet Union, was that in 1921, 5 million Russians starved to death. By November 1920, the Russian Civil War was over. Lenin's Reds had defeated the Whites who were loyal to the Tsar. The Reds' victory was in large part due to the head of the war effort, Leon Trotsky, second in command only to Vladimir Lenin, and also by the political dealings of a guy named Joseph Stalin, who was the secretary for the Soviet Union. In other words, he was kind of the guy who ran the political aspects of the Soviet Union, while Trotsky was in charge of the military. By the way, when I say that Joseph Stalin was secretary, I don't mean that he was taking notes somewhere for someone. I mean his title was the Secretary General of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. In other words, he ran the Bolshevik Party. With the Civil War behind them, the Soviet Union looked to take back the territories that they had lost with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which of course, with Germany losing as part of World War I, were rendered null and void. Finland remained independent. The Soviet Union was not able to take over Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, at least initially, but they did take over Ukraine, they did take over Belarus, and the Caucasus mountain countries of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Lenin would not rule much longer after this. If you remember, we talked about that assassination attempt where he was shot in the neck and in the shoulder. Complications from that assassination attempt caused Lenin to suffer a series of strokes between 1922 and 1924. With Lenin out of commission, this allowed Joseph Stalin to be able to take more and more power for himself as the guy who ran the Bolsheviks. Vladimir Lenin would die of a stroke on January 21st, 1924. And with his death, there would be a struggle for power between Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. But that's for the next episode. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you have a question or comment, please leave it respectfully and politely in the description box below. I'm Mr. McGee. Take care.